So the gospel that we got to hear Roger proclaim today, that was very exciting that I didn't have to read that very difficult gospel. Before today's request, we heard a request from the disciples to increase their faith. They asked Jesus, increase our faith. And before that, there had been hearing other things from Jesus. They were told that they should not cause little ones to stumble, that they should challenge their followers that falter and offer radical forgiveness to repentant sinners, that they should carry their own cross, that they should give up all their possessions. Don't cause little ones to stumble. The first one sounds kind of like the easiest, but I'm not so sure. I remember when I was working at a law firm in the 80s, when women were just starting to kind of come into that arena more fully. My sense of the young men was that they were very interested in someone stumbling other than them. And would their actions follow that? They would do things that would try, if a mistake were made, try to assign blame to someone else, that kind of sense of, we're in this together, or how can we improve from this mistake? Because like all professions, lawyers do make mistakes. It happens. And the question is, how do you deal with them? But I found that environment, certainly in my early years there, and I started practicing in large law firms in Chicago in the 80s, was that it was a place where there was the sense of covering your behind, and therefore letting little ones stumble was very much part of the culture. When I became an older associate, one of the things that I used to tell all young associates is that the first thing they need to start to do is when they're asked a question they don't know the answer to, rather than answering it, to say, I don't know, I'll get back to you. And I would actually have them say these words because for young lawyers who just graduate from law school, like many people at the beginning of their careers, they think they know everything. The more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. And so when you first come into something, I think it's really easy to think, I know it all, I can figure, and that's just not true. The more I practice, certainly the more I realize how much I didn't know. My other wonderful example of causing little ones not to stumble is a story of my mother. If you thought that her death meant that I wasn't going to tell you any more stories about her, you were wrong. So my mother grew up in a household in Nogales, Arizona, and it was kind of a biting place. It was not a place that suffered fools. It was not a place that was generous and kind to what I'll call the weak. My mom was the youngest, very, very shy, not aggressive. We wonder where I came from. So it was a hard time for her. And it's no wonder to me that she left at 18 to get married and get out of that environment. But happily, one of the early places she went to, because my father was in the Air Force, was England. And she lived in England for 3 years. And I never heard about this as a kid, but when I was older and would visit her, I heard so many stories about how blessed she felt to be in England. And this was right after the war, which was not an easy time in England. But she said the kindness of the people was just so, it was almost overwhelming to her. She felt accepted. She felt uncriticized. It was an environment that she never forgot. She never forgot that environment. And so when I think about not causing little ones to stumble, it's both that negative side of the ways that you can cut people down, assign blame to other people, whatever, but also how little it takes to have little ones not stumble, how little it takes. When I was in Chicago, I remember I live in the South Side. There were homeless people all the time. When I walked in the downtown in the Loop in my office, when I was in my neighborhood walking around, and I didn't always give money to them, but what I tried always to do was to look at them and to smile at them. And I remember once, one of the people that I ran across and I just looked at him and smiled, and he said, "You have given me a great gift." And it was just acknowledging presence and in a way that could give rise to a smile. I didn't have to give him any money. I gave him a gift by giving him a smile, by acknowledging his presence. That's how little it takes to follow those words of Jesus. Increase our faith. So when Jesus answers, after his earlier admonitions, what he answers is, the first part of the answer is, only a small amount of faith is necessary. This, of course, is very un-American. We always like to have more. We want to become more proficient. We want to become better. We want to amass more. It's the idea that a little bit is enough is kind of anathema to us, and clearly to the disciples as well. They were, what can we do to have more of this thing? What can we do to have more? And so Jesus' response is, it's quality and not quantity that matter. You can have just a little bit of good faith, and that's going to be enough to do God's work in the world. One of the writers that I read when I was preparing yesterday evening was that you don't need to have unshakable confidence or spectacular accomplishments. Those are not what's needed. The disciples were often without faith. We hear that many times in the Gospels where, the storm arises and they're all terrified. They don't have faith. And Jesus calms everything and says, "Oh, you have little faith." Where there's faith for a minute and then, Peter sinks into the water. Whereas Jesus talks about the great faith of others. He talks about the great faith of the blind beggar, of the Samaritan person with leprosy, of the hemorrhaging woman that we heard recently. And he tells them that your faith. So clearly, being in the presence of Jesus was not enough to keep that going, unless we think that we are defied by that. It can come from a different place. It comes from a different place. The second part of Jesus' answer to increase our faith is to serve others because of what God calls us to do and not for things. And unfortunately, we hear that in the context of a story about slavery, which for Americans is just a really difficult announcement. And one of the things that you need to remember is that the slavery of Jesus' time was not American slavery. American slavery was, I believe this is true, the first slavery that became multi-generational. You didn't just enslave yourself. All of your children were enslaved. That was not true of any other culture that had slavery. Any other culture. It was carried to the mother. And it didn't matter who the father was. You know that from many, many years of slaves whose children were also born in slavery. Jesus said, "I am among you as one who serves." So the slavery he's talking about is a life of service. It's not about the slavery that we as Americans know from our history. One of the other quotes that I read in preparing for this was something that I think about when I think about that smile for a homeless man in Chicago. And this was the most mundane act of faith
carries extraordinary potential for transforming the world into the image of the Creator. The most mundane act of faith carries extraordinary potential for transforming the world into the image of the Creator. When I was in deacon school, Frank Griswold, who was the bishop of Chicago at the time, had many meetings with the deacons. And at one of them, he told the story of a Monday, Thursday service he had at the cathedral there, where he was one of the bishops, back to them and washed people's feet. And after the service, one of the women who was present came up to him and told him about how transformed she was by having him do that. That she had, I can't remember exactly what the injury was, but there was some either physical or emotional trauma that she had, and found that the experience of having a bishop on his knees in front of her, washing her feet, had just changed her perspective. It had touched her deeply. And Frank Griswold did not know this story beforehand. And it was all about him doing what he did, that little thing of washing feet and Monday, Thursday service, that was able to do that for someone, was able to transform her world into the image of the Creator. We all have that power to use whatever little bit of faith we have to do not just big action, but also little action, little things all the time, every day, to everyone we encounter that can transform the world. I invite you to think of how you can do that as an individual and how we as a church can do that in our presence in this community.